Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for our second lecture in our Sherwood Speaker Series. We're delighted to have you, and for those of you who don't know me, I am Megan Bever, Vice President of the Sherwood Raider Farm Civil War Park and Associate Professor of History here at Missouri Southern State University. This speaker series is presented by the Sherwood Raider Farm Civil War Park, which interprets the May 18, 1863 engagement between Federal soldiers and Confederate partisans that left many black Union soldiers dead. The park also seeks to foster an understanding of the broader conflict that raged along the Missouri-Kansas border during the Civil War, and to promote the preservation of battlefields and historic sites. We hope that you'll take the time to visit the park and learn more about it by visiting our Facebook page. We also hope that you will mark your calendars for our third lecture. On February 24th, Jennifer M. Murray of Oklahoma State will present Preserving and Interpreting America's Most Iconic Battlefield, Gettysburg. This series would not be possible without the work of Bob Harrington, president of the Raider Farm Park Board, and Paul Tevereau and Virginia Lass, who serve on the organizing committee. In addition to support from the Raider Farm Board of Directors, we're grateful to Missouri Southern for partnering with us to host this event. We would like to thank specifically Brad Belk, Missouri Southern's community historian, and Brad Hodson, Executive Vice President and Executive Director of the Missouri Southern Foundation. Tonight's speaker, Jeremy Neely, is Assistant Professor of History at Missouri State University. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Missouri in 2004 and is author of The Border Between Them, Violence and Reconciliation on the Kansas-Missouri Line. His other writings include a study of reunions held by guerrillas who fought under William Cantrell, which appeared in Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri, The Long Civil War on the Border, and an award-winning article in Missouri Historical Review titled A Pure Son of Missouri, Freedman Borrows at the Crossroads of the Slaveholding Frontier. His current research focuses on Reconstruction era in Missouri. Tonight, his lecture is entitled Robert Van Horn's Civil War, Loyalty, Freedom, and the Evolution of the Border West. Please join me in welcoming him.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay? All right, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. It's a privilege to be a part of the speaker series, and it's a lot of fun. And so I'm excited to share with you some research that I've been, well, it was research that I set out to do on Reconstruction, as Megan said, but what I found was that in order to understand and to explain what happens in Missouri during the Reconstruction era after 1865, I really had to go back into the war and to make sense of the stories of the people that I was finding. And so the person that I'm talking about tonight, Robert Van Horn, is one of these figures who I think helps to explain how the war has this transformative effect upon Missourians. Missouri today we think of as the geographical middle of the country, but in 1860, of course, it's right there in the west. However, politically, it believed, and I think it was, the political middle. Missourians, generally speaking, in 1860, hoped to maintain some position near the middle of the political spectrum. And what that meant frequently was that preserving the status quo was all about saving the Constitution as it was, but it also involved protecting slavery. And so Missouri proves to be the only state that gives all of its electoral votes in the presidential election to the Northern Democrat, Stephen Douglas. If you just go on the internet, you can look at the county level results. For map nerds like myself, this is a lot of fun to see where our particular counties shook out. But you can see here that Stephen Douglas and John Bell, the Constitutional Union, the two moderates, they take most of Missouri, and Lincoln, represented in pink and red, he gets St. Louis, and one of the heavily German counties in the Missouri Valley. But the person I'm about to talk about tonight was one of these moderates, actually a self-described conservative, who is changed by the war. And a lot of the scholarship that we've had on Missouri, and very good scholarship, has explained the ways in which civil war, and especially occupation by federal troops, and also by emancipation, the ways in which they take a lot of people in the middle and they transform them to one degree or another into Confederate sympathizers. And I think there's a lot to this argument. Christopher Phillips, Aaron Astor, very good historians have explained this backlash against the Union. But I think an important part of the story to remember, especially for understanding Reconstruction, is that Missouri remains a Union state. Missouri sends a far greater number of soldiers to fight for the United States than it does for the Confederacy, even when we factor in the number of irregular partisans who fight with sympathies towards the South. And so my subject today, Robert Thompson Van Horn, is one of these Douglas Democrats who's galvanized by the war and goes in the other direction. He ends up, by 1865, as what he describes, a stalwart radical. And so it's about his evolution politically. Robert Van Horn became the unlikely Unionist savior of Kansas City, Missouri on the morning of June 11, 1861, when United States forces seized control of his adopted hometown without firing a single shot. When voters had elected him mayor just weeks before, civil war was already a familiar danger. For 5 years, pro-slavery and free soil partisans had killed one another in the adjacent counties of Kansas Territory. But now a secession banner hung from a flagpole at the corner of Walnut and 2nd, and for Mayor Van Horn, this, quote, insolent blazonry of a strange and bastard flag, end quote, was a worrisome sign of a gathering rebel storm. Delegates at Missouri's statewide convention in February had overwhelmingly voted against secession. But when Abraham Lincoln called upon the states to provide 75,000 men to put down the rebellion, Missouri's new governor, Claiborne Fox Jackson, defied the president. He instead mobilized the Missouri State Guard, fearing federal coercion, and persuaded legislators to give him sweeping authority to confront the crisis. Southern sympathizers also captured the federal arsenal at Liberty, carried off several hundred muskets, and 2 weeks later, dozens of them broke into a Kansas City storehouse and seized even more ordnance from the U.S. Army. So Van Horn, facing threats of assassination, quietly hustles across the state to St. Louis in search of whatever aid he can find. There he explains to Congressman Frank Blair Jr. the imminent danger faced by Jackson County Unionists. Jackson County, of course, was the jumping off point for a number of Western trails to Santa Fe, to California, to Oregon, and a surrender to Confederates threatened serious commercial losses, Van Horn believed. Rebels would also menace the new free state of Kansas, and Congressman Blair therefore urges Nathaniel Lyon, the newly installed commander in St. Louis, to authorize aggressive action. But with U.S. regulars 30 miles to the north up at Leavenworth or 100 miles to the south at Fort Scott, it seemed that Mayor Van Horn's ill-trained home guards would have to provide the Union muscle. Boats docked with such frequency at the Missouri River landing below Kansas City that few people must have apprehended anything strange about the arrival of the steamboat Emily in early June. Yet soon after its gangplank splashed down, would-be passengers stopped abruptly as they faced an unusual cargo about to be discharged from the lower deck. This included 2 companies of U.S. Army infantry with their rifles shouldered and bayonets fixed, an unlimbered section of artillery, and a number of mounted officers who swiftly led the men into formation on the nearby wharf. Captain William E. Prince then led his regulars up the steep incline above the levee. And you can see, before the grading was done in Kansas City along the river, how tall these bluffs were. Here we have the wharf, and then the houses built atop the bluffs here. He marches his men uphill, takes them several blocks down Main Street, and finally halts on the high ground around 10th Street, at a point which gives him a sweeping view of the town and the river below. Only later did locals learn that Prince's landing force from Leavenworth was part of a coordinated Union effort to secure the western border and much of the Missouri Valley. Most famously and importantly, Lyon's Federals took Jefferson City as Governor Jackson and secession legislators fled. A contingent under Everett Peabody moved upriver to St. Joseph. Days later, Prince's men moved upon Independence. And once the regulars returned to Leavenworth, Van Horn's battalion set themselves to the construction of Camp Union, a rectangular breastwork at the corner of 10th and Central, where they'd scavenged 2 large guns from the partisan feuds of Bleeding Kansas, but it turned out they lacked ammunition properly fitted for either piece, which I think was an apt metaphor for the Unionist situation in the summer of 1861. The bloodless capture of Kansas City belied the challenges that Western Unionists would face during the war. Years later, observers would give way too much credit when they claimed that Van Horn, quote, saved Kansas City to the Union. And others said, he saved Missouri in her terrible struggle. But the events of June 61 signaled his emergence as maybe the most consequential Unionist of the border. Throughout the war, he comes to occupy a singular place at the nexus of military command and the partisan press, as well as elective office. The rise of mayor, and then state senator, and then U.S. Congressman Van Horn proves to be a tale of personal ambition and civic service, which illuminates the symbiotic nature of loyal politics and Union military strength in a region of ambiguous and shifting loyalties. The Civil War erodes the political middle ground in a part of the country which liked to believe that it offered sensible moderation between the radical extremes of Northern abolitionists and Southern fire eaters. Once the war begins, as Van Horn and his neighbors find out, the middle is a dangerous place to be. The story of Van Horn reminds us that for some Unionists, the war is a galvanizing and transformative influence. Such latter-day radicals emerged from Civil War powerfully committed to a different kind of America. They share a new politics of loyalty. Some are surprisingly dedicated to a more racially equitable America. By war's end, their hold upon Missouri is more precarious than they would have liked to admit, but their moment, however brief, signals the promise as well as the fragility of Reconstruction. To understand how the war changes Van Horn, I want to step back and to at least briefly look at his life for the decades prior. He's born in 1824 in Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh, and he spends his early adulthood moving down the Ohio Valley. He bounces between jobs as an apprentice printer, a lawyer, a newspaper editor, a census taker. By 1854, he had taken the helm of the Cincinnati Unionist, a daily paper with more than 50 employees. But when a fire destroys his office, which was uninsured, and leaves him heavily in debt, he turns to work as a steamboat captain. Barely 2 weeks after Franklin Pierce signs the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Van Horn writes to his parents back in Pennsylvania, I'm going out west, probably to Nebraska, where I hope in a few years to retrieve my fortunes and kick up a dust amongst the natives. Earning $50 a month, Van Horn spends the summer of 1855 navigating the Mississippi, Wabash, and other western rivers. A fateful meeting in St. Louis convinces him to visit the city of Kansas, an ambitiously, if inaccurately named hamlet where local owners were eager to sell a fledgling paper they called the Enterprise. Intrigued, Van Horn spends 2 months in Kansas City, population 478, and on October 1st, 1855, he agreed to purchase the newspaper for $500, with half to be paid up front and the remainder due the next year, after he had returned with his wife Adela and their 2 young kids. Van Horn wielded his enterprise as a blunt instrument of pro-slavery boosterism. Writing from a second-story office above Kit Cole's Main Street Saloon, he quickly absorbed the political values of the slaveholding frontier. For several months, he publishes under a masthead that declared, "The world is governed too much." He steadfastly defended pro-slavery Missouri immigrants who had seized early control of Kansas territory. He lamented the slanders heaped upon them by the national press. He wrote, quote, "The people in the border counties of Missouri have been greatly misunderstood and still more misrepresented. Most bothersome were Easterners who condemned honest, law-abiding, and slave-owning households as border ruffians." Van Horn wrote, "There is not in the Union a more brave, frank, open-hearted, and generous people." The Enterprise held that if anyone was to blame for the bitter turn in territorial and national politics, it was fanatical, anti-slavery hirelings from New England. His ardent solidarity with slaveholders put Van Horn squarely in the mainstream at a time when dissenters found it hard to stick around. A backlash against a German-language rival was called the Daily Kansas City Post, forced its anti-slavery editor to take refuge across the river in Kansas. Van Horn styled his paper a fearlessly conservative Democratic paper. At times, his editorials employed the unabashed racism of pro-slavery peers. And there are a number of ugly examples that I could cite. But he reserves even sharper criticism for abolitionists descending upon Kansas. These revolutionists, he argued, threatened to foment violence, economic collapse, and even the destruction of the American Republic. He maintained that anti-slavery radicals exemplified a true black Republican spirit, which tended towards disunion and civil war. He urged the creation of a vigilance committee after the fashion of San Francisco, and promoted the organization of a Kansas Pioneer Association to encourage pro-slavery migration across the border. The enterprise also reveals white anxieties about fugitive slaves and racial disorder. Advertisements showed that the hiring out of enslaved labor was common. But along the open border south of the Missouri River, where there existed no natural boundary between Missouri and Kansas, and where Kansas City sits, African American mobility threatened to destabilize the slaveholding order. Free people of color were a tiny portion of Kansas City's small but growing population. But to slavers, they seemed a catalyst to a fugitive exodus. Mayor M.J. Payne announced sharp limits upon the nighttime movements of, quote, any free Negro or mulatto, end quote, who failed to carry a pass obtained from city officials. Late-night assemblages of African Americans, including those with passes, were now prohibited. Free blacks caught violating these restrictions suffered fines of $1 per violation. Non-slave-owning whites who tried to issue passes to blacks faced fines of at least $20. The arrest of Silas Case revealed the length to which local authorities would go to regulate the mobility of African Americans. Notified that white men tried to induce enslaved women to flee into Kansas, a Kansas City police officer named Kerr commenced a stakeout from inside an outhouse near the kitchen of slaver J.W. Summers. When Case one night quietly moved across Summers' backyard with an enslaved young woman, Kerr burst from the privy and arrested him. Van Horn wrote, Negro thieves are having a hard streak of luck in Kansas City and ought to be convinced by this time that Missouri slaves have not such a romantic idea of freedom as these rascals would pretend to believe. Van Horn's tireless work in promoting the white man's democracy reaped dividends. President Buchanan named him Kansas City Postmaster in 1859. By then, the enterprise had been renamed the Journal of Commerce and soon sold to D.K. Abeel. Years spent advocating local development won him praise on both sides of the border. One Kansas paper endorsed his bid for the Missouri General Assembly and claimed, Van is worth more to Kansas City than any 10 other men. That 1860 campaign comes to naught, but he retains a prominent perch as civic gadfly. Anonymous letters published in the journal bore an uncanny resemblance to the voice of Robert Thompson Van Horn. A letter from T scolded South Carolina in 1860, saying, quote, what is to be gained by the efforts of those who are trying to inaugurate a system of secession and disunion, discord, and commercial distrust? What is to be gained by whining about imaginary political wrongs? What is to be gained by civil war when it costs us more money than all the slaves in the Union are worth and more lives than our glorious independence? And so, in the midst of this heated presidential election, he has shifted his ire from abolitionists now to the fire eaters in the Deep South. The Journal, though, and Van Horn remain steadfastly Democratic. But an ardent constitutionalism informs his editorials and much of the paper. An 1861 editorial said, however much we may deprecate the election of Lincoln, our first reverence is for the Constitution of our common republic. After delegates in St. Louis overwhelmingly vote against secession by a 9-1 margin, it seemed that the crisis had passed, that Missouri was firmly bound to the Union. The Army's capture of Kansas City seems to reinforce this bond, but there was still great danger that rebels or guerrillas might attack and retake the town. Prince hoped that the proximity of federal troops in Leavenworth would deter aggression. Quote, I can hardly suppose the secession of Jackson and Clay counties will be so foolish as to invite another visit from our troops. At the second coming, they could hardly expect the pacific deportment of the first. Still, irregular partisans along the river were a bother. Assailants stoned the Unionist volunteer who guarded the town's ferry. Prince urged Van Horn to take a firm hand in policing them. By no means suffer these secession rebels to luxuriate in their rebellious promptings, which are nothing more than irritating arrogances. Peace and quiet must and shall be the order of the day in Kansas City, if it has to be procured at the point of a bayonet. But unlike St. Louis, Kansas City will not experience martial law for a number of years. And the federal commanders will justify this, saying that the Eastern Theater took greater priority. They simply did not have the manpower to implement this. Van Horn's first expedition beyond Camp Union confirmed Kansas City's isolation and its vulnerability. On July 16th, Captain Prince directed 2 companies southeast to Austin to relieve Major Dean's Cass County Home Guard, which was escorting a supply train bound for Fort Scott. When Van Horn's men stopped to lunch at a wooded spring north of Harrisonville, a rider named Benjamin Hayes approached. Claiming to be the sheriff of Cass County, Hayes asked the soldiers' intentions and reported that local citizens were unnerved by soldiers moving across the countryside and that they were now arming themselves in response. Van Horn explained he was an officer in the service of the United States marching south under orders from Leavenworth, but that peaceful citizens would not be harmed regardless of their political loyalties. The sheriff promised to relay this pledge back to Harrisonville and to return that evening with news of the citizens' response. When Hayes fails to come back, the Unionists realize that his visit was a ruse to assess their numbers, and so they prepare for confrontation. A scout confirmed the presence on the nearby prairie of some 400 horsemen, plus another company of foot soldiers, which is a force about 3 times their own size. Van Horn agrees to an interview with the leader of these men and restated his assurance not to harm unoffending loyals. The leader stated that the people in that part of the country would allow no U.S. troops to be stationed among them, and that if the Kansas City men persisted in moving southward, violence would result. Van Horn quickly rode back to his command, now drawn into a line along the adjacent timber, and barely 15 minutes later, the rebels opened fire. Hemmed between a cornfield on their right, a ravine on their left, and the woods behind them, the inexperienced Unionists managed to hold off their attackers for 3 hours until the enemy finally retired. Neither side suffers serious casualties in this skirmish, which takes place 4 days before the first Battle of Bull Run. But by sundown, Van Horn realizes the vulnerability of their situation. They're now 20 miles away from Camp Union, but still several hours of marching from their destination. They're significantly outnumbered, and they have about 10 days' rations. The Council of Officers that night surmises that felling trees in the now cleared cornfield might allow them to hold this position until reinforcements arrive. But 2 discoveries change their assessment. The first is that Major Dean is no longer where he's supposed to be, but had moved west to West Point, which is another day's march over towards the Kansas line. But in addition, their cartridge boxes showed they were going to run out of ammunition in a matter of hours if the rebels show back up. And so, that night they retreat. Van Horn's command proves to be nearly out of its depth, literally, in fact. Lashed by a driving rainstorm, they break camp at 2 in the morning. Even before they reach the nearest road, one of their wagons breaks. It founders in the thick mud. They trudge on for another mile until confounding darkness leads the officers to halt the march. They stood in the road another hour, soaked by what Van Horn later called as hard a rain he ever witnessed. They resumed moving at daylight. They chopped down a tree to clamber across the swollen and flooded Grand River. They managed to swim the horses across to safety, but their wagon bed sank. They pitched their baggage and stores downstream. Soggy, miserable, the men spend another day sloshing across the marshy bottoms of the Osage Valley. Van Horn, though, closes his report of the affair with ironic buoyance. The men, he writes, finally encamped without blankets or tents, and many of them without coats or shoes, which they've lost in the muddy waters, but they soldiered on bravely, quote, bearing everything with fortitude and cheerfulness. He's a good writer, at the very least. More problems followed. Van Horn wanted to enroll his home guard into a full federal regiment, But so many Jackson County volunteers had crossed the state line to fight in Kansas regiments that the remaining pool of able-bodied men, according to grumbling neighbors, was now somewhat emasculated. Charges of permitting lax discipline threatened to undermine his stature further. Captain Prince learned that the men of Camp Union were selling alcohol in defiance of U.S. Army regulations. But 9 junior officers sprang to Van Horn's defense, and the charges resulted in no disciplinary action. Secesh guerrillas proved to be a far graver threat than illicit beer sales. Van Horn warned that the Union presence in Kansas City hardly assured the stability of the surrounding countryside. He wrote, "Jackson County is in sentiment the strongest secession county in Missouri. The feeling in neighboring counties was no better. Residents of Westport feared Jayhawker attack from Kansas. Some home guards were dismissed for disloyalty. And most audaciously, a company of 16 secessionists marched right into Kansas City and ordered a home guard named John McClellan to stop in his tracks. When Sergeant McClellan asked under whose orders they made such a demand, they exclaimed, 'The authority of Jeff Davis.' The rebels attacked McClellan, they beat him unconscious, and only the arrival of other home guards saved McClellan and resulted in a few other injuries to each side. This struggle to maintain order in Kansas City streets bespoke a widening collapse of civil government in Missouri. The withdrawal of Secesh officials created a power vacuum, which the U.S. military scrambled to fill. Brigadier General John Pope called for the establishment of committees of public safety in Missouri towns. Pope wrote to Van Horn that committees in Jackson County should include the town's wealthiest and most prominent men, and at least some rebel sympathizers. Quote, "I am resolved that for every breach of the peace, they shall suffer a pretty severe penalty," end quote. The regulation of river traffic tightened. Ships on the Missouri River now had to submit full lists of their crew. Pilots pledged not to share any information about the movements of U.S. troops, not to receive arms or ammunition without written authority, nor to transport suspected rebels. Only then could ships engage in legitimate steamboat traffic with the full protection of Union authorities. After the rebel victory at Wilson's Creek on August 10th and the death of Nathaniel Lyon, things looked even worse for Missouri Unionists. Theodore Case traveled to St. Louis to secure desperately needed supplies for the Kansas City Home Guard. He reported to Van Horn that secessionists had attacked Potosi. They were now poised to strike along the North Missouri and Missouri Pacific railroads. Case estimated that 4,000 federal troops were dispersed across St. Louis, but alarm gripped the city. He wrote, "The common expression here now is, 'Hell is broke loose,' and the Post certainly gives some color of truth to the assertion." Van Horn fears that Camp Union could hardly repel local raiders, much less the advancing column of Sterling Price's Missouri State Guard. Prince said Leavenworth could not spare federal reinforcements, nor improve his situation with the desperation and the lack of supplies. If possible, the men should retreat to Kansas if facing overwhelming numbers. Van Horn ordered his men to remove $143,000 in gold from the Mechanics and Union banks and to safeguard the funds at Fort Leavenworth. This move does not win him friends among local bankers. Van Horn writes, "The truth is that the only sympathy exerted for the government is by the power of the guns under my command. I am totally surrounded by a hostile sentiment and by a hatred of the government which no county in South Carolina can surpass." When it became clear that Price's army was not striking at Kansas City but was instead looking downriver at Lexington, Van Horn hastens his volunteers there. They joined James Mulligan's entrenched force of 3,000 Unionists. Price's army, however, reaches the Missouri River with more than 18,000 men. On September 20th, the third day of Price's siege at Lexington, his guard employed hemp bales seized from a nearby warehouse and uses them as a movable breastwork, rolling them toward the Union trenches. That afternoon, Mulligan surrenders his exhausted men, who have run out of food, water, and most of their ammunition. Days after Price agrees to parole his prisoners, the Kansas City and St. Joseph Reserve Corps finally are reorganized and mustered into active federal service, now the 25th Missouri Infantry Volunteers. Second in command is the now promoted Lieutenant Colonel Van Horn, who had been amongst the 120 men wounded at Lexington. Yet despite Price's victories in the summer of '61, secessionists failed to break the federal hold upon Missouri's major rivers and towns. General John C. Fremont belatedly sent Union reinforcements from St. Louis. The Missouri State Guard drifts southward towards the Ozarks, but the turning point comes in early 1862 when Samuel Curtis's outnumbered Federals will defeat Confederates at Pea Ridge, and after this point, conventional rebel forces will not seriously menace most of Missouri for the duration of the war. In their absence, guerrilla bands of pro-Confederate irregulars, including a growing number of rebel deserters, will pose a more serious threat. James D. Eads of Sedalia, captures the plight of loyal men in the West as the first winter of war approaches. He wrote, "No man, or his family, or his property, will be safe a single day after he is known to be a Union man or sympathizes with our efforts to sustain the government. Nothing but prompt and energetic measures on part of the government will save our population from murder and starvation. The rebels have declared that no Union man shall remain in this part of the state." Here he underlines the entire sentence. "And you may rest assured that they mean to do just what they say," he wrote to new department commander Henry Halleck. To underscore the danger, Eads closes with a litany of items stolen by disloyal marauders, including livestock, guns, household items, and even women's apparel. The 25th Missouri becomes one of many volunteer regiments sent east over the next year. They first joined the Army of the Tennessee's 6th Division. On April 6th, one of the regiment's pre-dawn patrols becomes one of the first Union regiments to clash with Albert Sidney Johnston's rebels at Shiloh. The ensuing battle produced one of the bloodiest days in U.S. history. The carnage in the Hornet's Nest left the 25th Missouri, in the words of one survivor, badly cut up. Perry Newberry wrote to his mother that the regiment began the engagement with 825 men, and they left it with 441. With the death of their colonel, Everett Peabody, command of the regiment momentarily devolves upon Van Horn. But the spring of 1862 found Van Horn at a crossroads in his military service. On one hand, he desperately desired the promotion. His regiment is now busy constructing earthworks outside of Corinth, Mississippi. And he wrote to Missouri's provisional governor, Unionist Hamilton Gamble, on May 16th, quote, "I know no reason why I should not receive it." But on the other hand, that same letter betrayed a growing ambivalence about serving so far from home. Quote, "I do not desire to remain much longer in the Army. I have determined long since to resign when the government regained possession of the Mississippi and when our Missouri was rescued from the rebels. That time is near at hand." Nearly 24 men from the 25th signed a petition to Halleck endorsing Van Horn's promotion, but that honor instead passed to Chester Harding. A month later, undaunted, Van Horn appeals to Gamble again, this time seeking a military command on the Missouri-Kansas line. He submitted an undated petition from 200 of Kansas City's most prominent men as proof of broad support for his return. But he disclaimed any enthusiasm for the opportunity. Quote, "It contemplates a task no man need envy or wish, but our people, my old neighbors, have suffered so much and so long that I could not refuse when they think it important." Again, Gamble deflected the application, claiming he had no power to assign officers to such a position. Van Horn's acute ambition surfaced in other ways. A May 29th issue of the St. Joseph Weekly Herald noted that he was a candidate in the forthcoming election for the state Senate. In November, Kansas City voters elected Van Horn with a margin that the Herald described as a clean sweep. He joined the General Assembly at a moment of sharpening debate over emancipation. President Lincoln's proclamation of January 1st, 1863, did not apply to loyal slave states, and the question of how to proceed against slavery divided Missouri Unionists. There were rival factions of charcoals, who favored aggressive action, and claybanks, who urged a more gradual approach. Missouri legislators failed to agree upon an emancipation ordinance, and Gamble revived the statewide convention which had been convened in 1861 for the question of secession. Anti-slavery voters urged Van Horn to join this convention, but he refused. and instead condemned the proceeding. A return to active military service gave him a convenient reason to withdraw from consideration, but a June 4th letter expressed real misgivings about this assembly, which he argued had outlived its purpose and now had no legitimate existence. With the war entering its third year, Van Horn saw the convention as a, quote, extraordinary and dangerous assumption of power, a perversion of all our ideas of representative government. He exclaimed, "Is there then any longer a people or government in Missouri outside of this convention?" I've had the opportunity to study the Missouri-Kansas border war for as long as I've thought of myself as a historian, but I was surprised to learn that in a familiar part of the border war, which many of you know about, that Van Horn played a role that I was completely unaware of. This darkest chapter, of course, is the attack upon Lawrence, Kansas, and then the Union response to it. And as many of you well know what happens, on the morning of August 25th, William Quantrill leads a band of 400 guerrillas, many of them from Missouri, on a dawn attack of Lawrence, where they kill 170 men and boys and burn much of the town to the ground. The Union commander, Thomas Ewing Jr., had strung garrisons along the state line, but federal troops had failed to apprehend Quantrill's raiders. In the immediate aftermath of Lawrence, Kansas men mobilized to exact bloody vengeance upon a Missouri town. To forestall such an attack and to prevent further bushwhacking, Ewing announced from his headquarters in Kansas City a forceful escalation of the Army's anti-guerrilla policy. This policy, executed in General Order Number 11, said that all disloyal Missourians living within parts of 4 border counties must leave their homes within a fortnight. It's the 4 counties directly south of the river: Jackson, Cass, Bates, and the northern tier of Vernon County townships. These disloyal Missourians, Ewing believed, were the reason that the guerrilla insurgency, frankly, to use a 21st century term, the reason it had survived and gained strength for so long. These were the households, their wives, their mothers, their relatives, who were providing food, shelter, fresh horses, intelligence about the movement of Union troops. And so if the Union Army can't find and defeat the guerrillas, they'll destroy the basis of their support. People who could prove their loyalty to local commanders could avoid banishment. But all abandoned homes and farmsteads would be left vulnerable to marauders, to plundering troops, to desolating prairie fires. Order Number 11 will eject as many as 20,000 people. And although it received increasing scholarly attention, the details of how Union officers execute this policy remains less well known. Ewing recognized that in addition to a certain firmness, this measure also required political acumen to comprehend the tangled loyalties of wartime Missouri. He explained to John M. Schofield, the commander of the Department of Missouri, who's in St. Louis, quote, "I will have to clear out a good many rebels. The political winnowing," he continued, "demanded a certain kind of expertise." He concluded his telegram, quote, "I need Lieutenant Colonel Van Horn," end quote. Few people could claim on the western border to have been a more dutiful observer of local sentiment. Back in the summer of '61, when he's splashing around the Osage Valley, Van Horn had become to keep a handwritten list of known secessionists. Such efforts anticipated the intimate record-keeping that is now essential to Ewing's household war, but 2 years earlier. One curious note that I found: Van Horn's appointment probably benefited from the support of Unionists and Confederates alike. H.C. McDougall later claimed that his fellow rebels pleaded with Ewing to appoint Van Horn provost marshal to carry out this deportation, given the former mayor's, quote, "honest and sympathetic, generous and humane reputation." The text of Order Number 11 said that Kansas City would be spared, but military records show that Provost Marshal Van Horn issued orders of banishment there for 64 people just within his first week of appointment. Most of these were heads of household, some were men, others were women. Van Horn proved willing to spare some of the individuals facing exile. His intercession on behalf of Nehemiah Holmes bespoke a sensitivity to the complexity of family politics. Loyal neighbors insisted that Nehemiah was a solid Union man, but his brother Hezekiah fully deserved expulsion. And Van Horn agreed, believing Hezekiah to be, quote, the most obnoxious man, end quote. Citizens whose loyalties remained less clear got put on a suspected list, and they would face further scrutiny from Union detectives until additional evidence could conclusively establish their loyalties. Order number 11 stipulated that disloyal Missourians had until mid-September to leave. But I found that banishments continued well into the fall. A series of October orders signed by Van Horn said exiles had 10 days to remove directly to New Mexico. Wiley Aiken, meanwhile, faced a similar deadline, but he got permission to head to Illinois, or another loyal state. Evidence suggests that Union officers who carried out this order were frequently short-handed. By the end of October, officers are transferring deserters, prisoners of war, disloyal, over to St. Louis because they simply don't have enough hands to guard them. Van Horn's tenure as provost marshal ends with his return to Jefferson City. A growing chorus of constituents demanded in the Journal of Commerce that emancipation and the politics of loyalty assume greater importance in the next session of the General Assembly. On November 11th, radical unions meet in Kansas City and call for the permanent disfranchisement of all Missourians who had been part of the rebellion. The local paper, though, expressed faith that their state senator would make railroads the great interest of this session. With luck, trains might yet run between St. Louis and the Kansas line within a year's time. On his trip back to Jefferson City, Van Horn's train actually crashes. It kills a man. It injures Van Horn and two other legislators, but he recovers, and it's a matter of weeks before he achieves his signature legislative triumph, which is a railroad bill, which will subsidize the completion of the Missouri Pacific all the way to Kansas City. Success fuels continued ambition. Barely a month after his honorable discharge from the 25th, 70 fellow legislators will petition President Lincoln to give Van Horn authority to raise a brigade of volunteers. The president denies the request, but the senator's political star was undimmed. And this becomes the pattern of Van Horn's Civil War. Aspirations for promotion within the military consistently denied, but returning over and over again to Kansas City, where he is as beloved as ever. Neighbors urge him to run for mayor once more, and he coyly replies, "When I can serve her, I am always ready." He wins that April election decisively, claiming 80% of the vote. The summer of 1864 exposed the degree to which the war has hardened his loyalist politics. On April 20th, he convenes the radical Unionists in Kansas City and declares that the ongoing struggle has distilled Americans into two factions, patriots and traitors. He was especially critical of Missouri's provisional government and the enrolled Missouri militia, an anti-guerrilla force created in 1862. Critics derided this so-called pawpaw militia as a refuge for paroled rebels, men of dubious loyalty. Mayor Van Horn, the former chair of the state Senate's Committee on the Militia, unleashed a series of scathing newspaper columns that blasted what he called the criminal impotency of new provisional governor, a guy he calls Willard Pawpaw Hall. And what's particularly galling to Van Horn is that in 1862, the previous provisional governor, Hamilton Gamble, had delayed statewide elections for governor and for lieutenant governor. And so it seems to just be a provisional government in perpetuity without a direct vote from the people. One piece claimed that Willard Hall, quote, has betrayed his neighbors and his state into the hands of the worse than savage bushwhacker and guerrilla. He holds his office not by the suffrages of the people, but by trickery and fraud upon the elective rights of the people of this state. Nobody wants him any longer. And this is what he's saying about fellow Unionists. Arguing that actions spoke louder than words, Van Horn contrasted Hall's passivity with an entire slate of radical candidates, each of whom had taken up arms in defense of the Union. That summer, Van Horn attended the Baltimore Convention where Lincoln gets renominated for president. His loyalty does not go unnoticed. U.S. Senator John B. Henderson of Missouri recounted to Van Horn in August that, quote, Uncle Abraham has taken up the most unaccountable liking to you. The president said, you must run for Congress and be elected. Van Horn assented, and local Unionists rallied behind his candidacy. That fall of 1864 marks the final test of Union strength in Missouri. Since 1862, commanders have moved federal troops out of the state to fight in the east. Order number 11 shunts guerrillas from the Kansas border, but irregular warfare still consumes much of the state. Although the statewide convention embraced a program of gradual emancipation, it would not be fully realized until well after 1870. Enslaved Missourians capitalized upon the chaos sown by war to seize their chances for freedom. Union troops aided this process but failed to thwart the fearsome and violent backlash against African Americans by furious whites. And this is the context in which Sterling Price begins his audacious cavalry invasion into Missouri ahead of the fall election. Riding north from Arkansas, Price's rebel army eyes the Union stronghold of St. Louis. He believes that sympathetic Missourians will rise up en masse and supply them with much-needed recruits. The invasion, however, yielded little but disappointment. Recruits never materialize in the numbers Price expects. And after their advance halts some 50 miles southwest of St. Louis, the Confederates turned west towards Jefferson City. As Price's army moves up the Missouri Valley, now with Federals in dogged pursuit, Unionists on the border mobilized. Mayor Van Horn agreed to lead a regiment of 60-day volunteers, and hundreds of Kansans are pouring across the border into town. The engagement that unfolded in October became the largest Civil War battle west of the Mississippi. On Saturday, October 22nd, Union forces and Price's Confederates clashed across the hills and timbered valleys of the Little Blue River. By mid-afternoon the next day, Union troops routed rebels at Westport and drove them southward across Kansas back into Arkansas. Newspaper evidence does not show that Van Horn participates in the battle except as an observer and an aide to General Samuel Curtis, but friends, again, are quick to hail the mayor as savior once more. Said one, Van Horn has now twice saved the city from falling into rebel hands. And days later, they elected him to the first of 4 terms in the U.S. House. The Civil War made Van Horn. His military service and his political ascent tracked the triumph and the persistence of loyal Missouri in microcosm. Union strength was often far more tenuous than he and his friends liked to believe, but victory brought he and fellow radicals and their vision nearer to fruition than ever. The convention charged with drafting a new Missouri Constitution passed an ordinance that abolished slavery on January 11, 1865, 3 weeks before the U.S. House of Representatives voted to approve the 13th Amendment. Soon after the long-anticipated Pacific Railroad finally reached Kansas City, you can see it right there, Van Horn will fulfill its claim as the inevitable great market of the Great West by building the first bridge across the river. In addition, the ironclad loyalty oath imposed under the new state constitution purged former rebels, as well as their sympathizers, from public life. A range of behaviors that people during the Civil War, if they had committed these sins, they would lose the right to vote, teachers would lose the right to teach, preachers could not preach, lawyers could not practice law in Missouri. But Van Horn is totally unapologetic. He writes in October 1866, quote, "The policy which put down the war shall settle the result," end quote. But it turned out that Reconstruction was far from settled in Missouri. In the former slave states of the defeated Confederacy, congressional Reconstruction brought years of military occupation, and it stipulated that readmission to the Union required the enfranchisement of African American men. The loyal state of Missouri, however, did not experience a similar period of post-war federal oversight. A radical proposal to extend the ballot in Missouri to African Americans failed in 1868. 2 years later, after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, black enfranchisement comes to Missouri, but only with the abandonment of the test oath against former rebels. A latter-day radical, Van Horn had seemed a lukewarm abolitionist, and such ambivalence certainly limited the potential of Reconstruction. The rise of a more conservative Republican faction, whose leaders styled themselves liberal Republicans, brings an end to radical rule in Missouri. In 1870, Van Horn loses his re-election for another term in Congress, but he returns to the helm of the Journal of Commerce, a perch which he will maintain for the next several decades. He's still going strong early into the 20th century. Former Confederates soon regained control of Missouri affairs, but Old Van, the Union savior, would remain the father of Kansas City for decades to come. Each of these, I believe, was a telling reminder of the Civil War's complicated legacy on the western border. Thank you.